Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Forensic Investigator Podcast, hosted by Dr. Jim. Today's discussion will be about DNA and how it has contributed to the forensic investigation process and what one should expect to see as a result of an investigation. In order to do that, I want to introduce you to my guest, Sam Spencer, who is the co-founder and owner of SCP Forensic Consultants based out of Memphis, Tennessee. A seasoned expert in DNA analysis since 2009, Sam began her career as a special agent forensic scientist in the Forensic Biology Unit of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which I think was correct,
Mhm.
where she personally processed over 1,400 cases for multiple agencies. Her extensive technical expertise spans YSTR analysis, next-generation sequencing, probabilistic genotyping, and outsourcing lab analysis. And as a comment, when you get a chance, Sam, I want you to simplify those terms a little bit later on.
Yes.
As an accomplished expert witness, Sam has provided testimony more than 55 times for both prosecution and defense counsel across several jurisdictions, including federal courts. Her hands-on field experience includes serving on the violent crime response team, processing and documenting active crime scenes for local law enforcement. Today, as an independent forensic expert, she has consulted on over 200 cases. Beyond forensics, Sam's diverse scientific background includes roles as a molecular diagnostic technologist at the Greenwood Genetics Center and a lead researcher at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, also in Memphis. Hello, Sam, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Good. I'm really happy to have you. I'm glad to see you again. It's been a while. Okay.
Yes.
And I want to set the stage a little bit and allow me to recommend a book called The Blooding by Joseph Wambaugh. Published in 1989, it recounts the first murder investigation in England solved through DNA fingerprinting, a breakthrough that forever changed modern criminal justice. Now, the case centers on the rape and murder of two teenage girls, Linda Mann, found dead in 1983, and Dawn Ashworth, found dead in 1986, in the village of Narborough, UK, United Kingdom. What followed was a massive manhunt, a revolutionary scientific development, and a landmark moment in forensic history. But one of the things that was most striking to me beyond that was that historically, this was the very first time it was really used in a criminal setting. And while it identified the true killer, it also exonerated one who had previously confessed. So it remains one of the earliest and most powerful examples of how science can not only identify the guilty, but also protect the innocent. Sam, tell us a little bit about the history, where we are today, how don't go too far back, but bring us
Yeah.
to where we were in the United States. And then, if I'm correct, I think 93 was the first case in court. Was that, and that it actually was accepted? But please proceed.
Yeah, so actually the first case was in 87 in
Okay.
Florida. So they sentenced a man down there for a sexual assault. But Virginia was in about that same time frame. Virginia was the first state crime lab to start using DNA testing for criminal cases. So pretty early on. But we really don't get going in the forensic community with what we think of today's DNA testing until PCR is developed. And PCR is polymerase chain reaction. And this allows us to make copies of really small portions of DNA on a tiny instrument. It's about as big as a book. It can fit on a desk. So this takes us from what we were doing back in the early 80s of needing a lot of DNA samples, meaning blood, semen, or saliva. And we don't need as much anymore. We still need a good amount, but we're not needing an excessive amount in what we would think of in today's terms. So by the late 90s, early 2000s is when this really catches on and we start seeing not gel electrophoresis, meaning on literally a gel, and we're applying an electrical current to move that DNA through it. We're then putting it on an instrument that it's using a capillary or a big straw to separate out these pieces of DNA. And so again, we're using the science that we're seeing in the research field and we're applying it to forensics and using that to get more sensitive and faster in getting results. And so really we've kind of sprinted in the world of science. Forensics has really sprinted in its techniques as to where we are now today. We're able to use just a tiny, tiny bit of sample collected from an item of evidence or from a scene, and we're able to generate a profile that we can say matches to an individual.
Okay. All of this is fed in to CODIS, right? The combined DNA database for the FBI. Is that correct?
So it depends. So CODIS has specific rules on what samples can go into it. First and foremost, it has to be attributable to a crime. So not only does it have to come from a crime, but it has to be linked to the perpetrator. So we're not
Okay.
putting in samples from the victim. We're putting in who we think is quote unquote the bad guy. And so CODIS is composed of not only those forensic unknown samples, but it's also composed of known samples or samples taken from individuals that we have either arrested or convicted for specific crimes. And that depends on your state as to what individual standards are going in there. So when we get a sample and process it in the lab, we're able to then upload it into CODIS. It will then search those known standards and those forensic unknowns to see if we can either connect cases to each other through those forensic unknowns or connect it to an individual.
That opened up a question for me there when you said that. Okay, so let's suppose it goes in, it's unknown. There's
Yes.
no hit in CODIS. And
Yes.
then 5 years later, we get a hit. Are the rest of the unknowns submitted in that case still remaining in CODIS?
Yes. So anytime you put a sample into CODIS, it stays there indefinitely, unless you get something from the investigator that says, so for example, if you had a sexual assault and say the victim had a consensual sex partner and it was figured out that that profile was consistent with that consensual sex partner, that profile would be taken out. But if this is a case that has not been solved, that sample is going to stay in there
Yeah.
indefinitely.
Well, and I would hope that it would too. That makes
Yes,
sense.
yes,
I was just thinking, I thought about the privacy issue a little bit there. Like a
yes,
boyfriend, for example, consensual act. Yes, that's a
exactly.
good
Yes,
example. And
yes.
that would mean, of course, getting his DNA to make sure you got the right profile to remove. Am I correct?
That's very true. So it's really important when we are processing samples from sexual assault kits, or even if we're processing samples from cases that involve known individuals in a house, for example, we want those standards from people who could have their DNA on that person. It makes it easier for us to eliminate them, right? But also to better find the quote unquote bad guy. Because we can remove people that we know, oh, this is your brother. Oh, this is your consensual sex partner, whatever that is. We can take those known standards we know have nothing to do with the crime and remove them from, say, mixture profiles that we get, so we know we're not looking for some unknown person. We're really focusing on the person's DNA that is the person of interest.
There's something that I've always done in my teachings too, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I've always made the statement that nothing is absolute in criminal investigation. Okay, and then
Yes.
someone raises their hand and says, "Well, DNA is." I said, "No, it's not. There's too many things that can happen." Explain a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so I have to say that's probably one of the biggest things that I try and get across in my role now. A lot of people do think that once we find your DNA, like that's it, we're done, and that's not true. Because our science has gotten very, very sensitive. We're talking about getting DNA from a couple cells. So a very small amount. And when you think about you interacting with your world, just your environment that you're in, you're going to be picking up DNA from other people. So there's a lot of research out there now that shows that transfer is happening between people you live with, people you work with, normal situations that you're interacting with, that you're collecting those people's DNA and you're giving your DNA to those people as well. So just because we find a DNA profile does not mean a crime occurred. So yes, DNA does identify that person, but it doesn't tell how or when that DNA was deposited on a person.
Okay.
And so we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at DNA results.
I suspect more of that has happened than we really know about, sadly, in one respect, but maybe
Yes,
good in others.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, what about tell me about mitochondrial DNA, what that is and what we're talking about there.
Yeah, so most people, when they hear mitochondria, they go back to high school and think, oh, that's the powerhouse of the cell. And you're right, it is the powerhouse of the cell, but it also has its own type of DNA in it. And so, what we can do with mitochondrial DNA is that we can use it to look at samples that have super degraded or damaged nuclear DNA. So when we're doing typical DNA testing, we're looking at the DNA present in the nucleus, or what, if you go back to high school, like the brain of the cell. So there's one copy of that in the nucleus. In a cell, you have hundreds of mitochondria, and so you have hundreds of copies of mitochondria. So even though that one copy in the nucleus has been damaged, you have tons of copies in the cell of that mitochondrial DNA that you can then make copies of and use it for analysis tools. So like I said, it's usually used in really damaged cells. So you hear a lot about this in human remains. If human remains have been found out, you think it's been there for years, that's a really good way to do it. Research does it a lot. If you're looking at somebody who's doing archaeology, that's how they're usually looking at DNA, is
Hmm.
through mitochondrial DNA. And so that's the method that we use when we have tough samples that we know have been damaged or are really old and we need to get a profile from. The one thing I do want to say about mitochondrial DNA is it is not the same as nuclear DNA, as in when we're talking about nuclear DNA, it's specific to an individual, whereas mitochondrial DNA is specific to the maternal line. So I have two boys. I use my boys probably too much in my testimony to give examples of things. But they have my mitochondrial DNA. So if I were to go through the process and develop a profile of my mitochondrial DNA and their mitochondrial DNA, we would look exactly the same. I would not be able to tell the difference between us three. But if we did autosomal testing or that nuclear DNA testing, I would very easily be able to tell the difference between us three.
Okay, okay. Is that the same thing as familial DNA?
Familial DNA. So, when we're talking about familial DNA, that's getting into the investigative genetic genealogy and looking at SNPs. So, SNPs are short nucleotide
Yeah.
polymorphisms,
Mhm.
and they're just smaller sections in the DNA that are really, really variable. And there's a lot of them. And so we can get a ton of data that we can then use that to search other databases, not CODIS, but other databases, to try and build a family tree and then eventually maybe identify a possible person through that.
I correct me again if I'm wrong. I'm
Yeah.
basing this on, I don't know if you know the name Rock Harmon or not.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, well,
Yeah.
many years ago, I was with him on a cold case thing with NIJ. But anyway, uh,
Yeah.
Rock had mentioned that back then, anyway, about there was only about what 13 states that actually did familial testing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that has really n I would say that familial searching is something that more labs are starting to do, as in using CODIS to do that searching, and they're doing that with YSTRs. So YSTRs are very similar to mitochondrial DNA in that instead of it being the maternal line, it's the paternal line. So going back to my boys again, my boys have the same Y chromosome or that paternal DNA as my husband. So if we were to sequence their Y DNA, they would all look exactly the same. And so you can find families within that Y, using that Y DNA to identify, hey, it's someone within this family. So yeah, not all labs are doing that. I think some of that is mostly based on um, how quickly they've started using YSTR analysis and what their database looks like. You need a sufficient amount of data to actually search it to make it usable. So if you don't have an actual database that you have enough data and you can't really search it, but it also has to go through that legal process. So I think the number is really low. It might still be 13. I don't think it has increased a lot in recent years.
Is there is any of that related to lack of funds for instrumentation or anything like that, or what? At all that you think of?
So, yeah, so it really depends on the lab, but yes, if people have not validated and gotten YSTR analysis on board and they're doing it in casework, then they're not going to be able to do that type of search and input that data into a database. So it does take a process. It uses the same instrumentation. It's a different chemistry because you're not looking at all of the DNA. You're just looking at that Y chromosome. So it's a different areas of the DNA that you're wanting to make copies of and then generate a profile from. So you've got to validate that part and the part on the instrument. So, and that takes time and energy and effort, and it's validation is not easy. And so that's definitely a part of that is not having uh that technique to be used. Yeah.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the standard for entry into CODIS is quite high, correct?
So it depends on how high within CODIS you're going. So there's 3 levels to CODIS. We have the local or ELDIS, state, ESDIS, and national or ENDIS. So what they do is they put a profile into what's called a match estimator, and it basically gives you a number of, hey, do we really think this profile is quote unquote rare enough that you're not going to get a bunch of bad hits back. So we're trying to get this profile in as high as we can, right? Because at the national database, I would be able to search profiles not only from Tennessee, being in Tennessee, but also from Arkansas, Kentucky, California, Michigan, all over the United States. And that is typically better than just searching within your state. But depending on the type of sample you get, and the profile you actually develop. It could be a partial profile, meaning you don't have all of the data at all of the locations you're looking at, or it could be degraded or damaged, so you don't have a full profile again. So you don't have enough data to really get it up to that national database. But that still means you may be able to search it within the state database, which may be all you need. You know, people People may, move and things, but depending on your state, if you're in the middle of a state database may be great for you. Being in Memphis, it was really good to get it up to the national database because I'm right next to Arkansas. I'm right next to Mississippi, right? We're really close. So it would be really easy for people to move to these other locations. So to be able to take advantage of those states' databases as well was really helpful to help solve cases.
Yeah, Memphis is geographically, you're right. You're right next door. What, 3 states get you right
Yeah,
away in a
right
matter of
away.
minutes. Yeah, a matter of minutes, you could be any
Yes.
one of them. Yeah, yeah, that's
Exactly.
true.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
So
that's
very
good.
important to be able to take advantage of that, of those states' databases. Yeah.
All right. You mentioned the genealogy thing a little bit. I just want to touch on it. I expect to have a genealogist later to talk more in
Yes.
depth to me. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Uh,
Yes.
but one of the things, one of my prior colleagues or a present colleague who's done quite a bit of this work as a detective
Hmm.
mentioned that before you get to the investigative genealogy phase, there's a lot of steps you have to go through first before they'll
Yes.
let you in. And does that sound pretty good or about right?
Yes. It's kind of the end all and be all. This is our last hurrah to try and do something with this sample that we have. So most of the time you've already submitted standards that you think are related to this person or maybe the person of interest. You've put it into CODIS and it's been sitting there for years and hasn't gotten any hits. And so you've got this case and you want to try and do something with it. So this is the route you would go. Um, the traditional testing that I did in the lab was not the data that you use for investigative genetic genealogy. So it's a whole other type of testing, that SNP testing, next generation testing that's done. So not only have we already done this other testing, but then we have to take into consideration, number one, is there enough sample left to actually move forward with this type of testing? Was it a mixture? So, mixture profiles mean that there's more than one person's DNA present in that sample. If it's a mixture, doing that type of testing, that SNP testing, that next generation testing is not always viable. So they have gotten better at it, but we're still not at the point where we can have what we call one-to-one mixtures of, say, in a sexual assault, we have 50% male DNA, 50% female DNA, and we as forensic scientists are able to separate out the male and female from each other. Uh, but that's not true with that next generation sequencing. So that has to be taken into consideration. And so if all of those things are good and we can do
Right.
something with that, that's when you then can push it off to that other lab who can do that testing, generate that data, and then it goes to somebody else who's actually going to build that family tree and do that investigative genetic genealogy to build the family tree, work backwards essentially to try and identify possible people of interest, who live in the right place, who are the right age, maybe the right description if there was a description for the perpetrator. And so you start finding that. Um, and then after that, you still have to get a sample from that person and connect it back to that evidence. So even though you have all this data that you've generated and you've found a person that you think is the perpetrator, you still need to go and do that traditional forensic testing of getting a standard from them and matching it to that actual evidence taken from the crime scene. So it's a huge burden. It's a lot of work to do the forensic investigative genetic genealogy, but it is solving huge crimes right now, and crimes that traditional DNA testing can't solve on its own. We needed that extra step to to pinpoint that person, right?
Okay, no, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but I had another
Yeah.
thought first, uh, and that is collection. It all
Yeah.
begins with finding it or finding a substance that will produce DNA in the collection process. Have we evolved much in that regard or not in the last, say, 10 or 15 years?
There have been attempts to get better at it. I know there are a number of labs who have gotten much better at developing profiles from, say, fired cartridge cases. They do pose a problem based on the composition of cartridge cases, and then the whole idea that a literal explosion happens and it is fired. DNA does not like hot things. I typically say if you are comfortable in a location, DNA will be happy in that location about, 72 degrees, not sunny, not being sunburn or anything like that. You are going to be happy. DNA is going to be happy. So an explosion is not necessarily something you want to be around. So yeah, labs have developed that, which has been really beneficial because, like I said, fired cartridge cases are something that, maybe the only thing left at the scene, right? And you have nothing else to go on, and you're like, I'm not getting viable profiles from it. Other than that, there has been some what they like to call eDNA or environmental DNA, meaning we're essentially vacuuming the area and trying to get any DNA that, like I said, that you're sloughing off, really skin cells are what you're sloughing off in the process, and collecting that. Now, you can imagine there's a whole host of problems with that. Um, yes,
Yeah,
very.
a lot of cross contamination there
Uh-huh.
possible. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes. So that's a problem. But really, the traditional methods are still hanging on. Swabbing, cutting out the sample. Some people do tape lifting. Um, there is a technique called the MVAC that is also used. It's what it sounds like. It sounds like a vacuum. It's literally putting a fluid down on a surface and then you vacuum it back up and you can use that fluid to yeah, it's really cool. Use that fluid to then take onto that DNA process. It works really well in um, non-porous things. So, you have a rock that somebody maybe beat somebody with, and you don't want the blood from the decedent. You want who was handling the rock. Swabbing can be really difficult with, rough surfaces like that. So, yeah, there has been some, but tried and true is that double swab technique of a wet and a dry swab, and using both of those to collect as much DNA as you can from that area.
And when you say wet, is that a saline solution usually or
Usually it's just deionized water is
okay.
what some people do use other chemicals. There has been some research on that, but water is usually the best for it.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. All right. You do very well and I would suspect the jury members like you.
I think they do. I think I'm usually an attorney told me that I am interesting to look at. So I
Yes, I'll agree.
I think juries at least will listen to me just because, oh, what is this weird lady coming in with all of this jewelry and high hair and all of this stuff on? Let me see what she has to say. So, but I hope eventually they're actually listening to the words that come out of my mouth rather than my eccentric attire. But
You
yeah,
eccentric at all, but that's okay. But your analogies with your kids, I think, is good. That's a good way to do it. So you got to break it down, and there's
yes,
always that alleged CSI effect. They all expect it, and it's not always there. And I keep
yeah,
telling people, don't believe it. And in fact, even if it is there, or someone does get a hit, make sure the entry was correct, and there's not a mistake on the entry because
yes.
you get one number or digit out of way, it changes the whole concept. So anyway,
Oh, yes, yes. No, yeah. I tell people all the time, most people tell me like, "Oh, I would hate to be on a jury." I was like, "You want to be a good citizen and really do something for your community, be on a jury. Sit in that courtroom, listen to a bunch of attorneys, listen to what your law enforcement uh agencies are doing, listen to what is happening in your community and help sit and make a decision about, you know, the data that's been provided to you. This is, I think, the coolest thing that I will probably never get to do because nobody is going to want me on their jury, unfortunately. But I think it's huge learning, especially if you expect the CSI effect to be happening, right? And then you can go home and be like, "Nah, people, this is not reality what you're seeing on TV." But also, you're actively playing a role in your community and your government. I think it's the coolest and easiest way to be involved in your community is don't be upset about getting a jury summons. Go and be excited and be a part of it.
I was, and I got turned down 3 times. So
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes.
so no,
Yeah.
they don't like having me on there.
No,
I guess either I didn't know enough or I knew too much. I don't know which it
exactly. I don't know
was.
which it is, but it was one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to run. I mentioned to you earlier about one of the other things I wanted to do, and I'm going to read something here that, if you don't mind, that
Yeah, please.
just as an opening here to another sort of the same topic, but a little different, because I'm a little concerned about it. And maybe I'm not concerned. Uh, it needs to be addressed, I guess,
Yeah.
and I clarified, because I can be wrong.
Yeah.
For a few years back, we had a lot of thousands, literally thousands of sexual assault kits across the country that had not been examined. And NIJ and some others got together and they started doing something about it.
Mhm.
And it created what they called the Sexual Assault Initiative, or SAKI, SAKI. If anyone's interested, you can say sexualassaultkitinitiative.com. And it was based on a federal grant funded by the Bureau of Justice, designed to help jurisdictions inventory, test, and investigate previously submitted or untested sexual assault kits. The program seeks to bring justice to victims, hold offenders accountable, and prevent future crimes. Now, I know Memphis, I think, about 18,000 or something, or was it 12,000? I
It
don't know.
was 12,000. Yep,
Okay, it was
12,000.
12,000. Yeah. But there
Mhm.
were other, I think Houston was 18,000, I think of what it was. A lot of others. But on their
Yeah.
site today, and I'm just going to mention this and we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
They said that, and this is most recent data, that approximately 205,000 kits were inventoried. Of those, 105,000 were actually sent out for testing. 20,000 had CODIS hits. And of those CODIS hits, approximately 13,000 were what they classified as serial sex offenders, while the remaining 7,000 or so were serial violent but non-sex offenders.
Mhm.
As I see the data, we're basically saying about 50% of the cases inventory actually had evidence that was viable for examination. Then I also see that only about 10% of the total number of cases actually received a CODIS hits.
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't mean it's still sitting there without a hit.
Yeah.
And those were divided up between the offenders, known sex offenders, and so on. Now, am I correct? 50%? I mean,
Mm.
is that the standard or the rule or guidelines? I mean, we collect 100 kits. We're only going to get 50% of them that are going to come up with any evidence worth working with? Or are we talking about stuff that was just too old and degraded?
So I think that's the main thing. That's what's happening with these kits is because, I mean, we had kits that I was processing. So I was here in Memphis when those 12,000 were found, and I was working some of them. And so the oldest case I worked was, I think, the same year that I was born, was 1987. And so when you're looking at DNA evidence like that, you would hope that that agency had properly stored it and maintained it. However, that's not what was happening, especially in Memphis. They had been put in a location that, like I said, if you were a human being, you would not have been comfortable sitting there for, at that point, 40 years. So, or not 40, it was 30 something years, I guess, at that point. But it was hot. The samples were very degraded, very damaged. So I vividly remember looking at one item of evidence that I could actually see the semen stain, but after extracting it and getting the DNA profile, it was so degraded and damaged that I couldn't do anything with it. It was heartbreaking to sit there and be able to, it's right there. Like, I don't have to do any testing. I can see the stain, but the DNA there has been so damaged because law enforcement did not properly maintain it that it's gone. The other part of this, I think, is also the statute of limitations. I mean, that changes, I feel like, on a whim. I don't know enough. I'm not a lawyer, thankfully. So those those laws, what back in 87 the statute of limitations was compared to 93, compared to 2003, are very different. And so most of the time when you look at these kits, you're like, this statute of limitations is gone. We're not going to go through the process of spending time, energy, and money to test it because we're not going to be able to do anything with it. And that might be later on they try and do something with it to put it into CODIS. But yeah, they're trying to get through these kits. So most of the time when I was dealing with it, it was due to the ones that were viable for testing were due to how they were stored and that statute of limitations. I know there were numerous times where it was like, hey, I've got somebody from the DA's office calling me, we need this worked as soon as possible because our statute of limitations is coming up next month. So if we can generate that profile, we can then have it and issue a warrant potentially if we get a hit to say this is the person. So we've stopped time essentially. So I think that is the major, that discrepancy of 50%, which it does sound, I totally understand that it's nuts that means that 1,000 people are just like, you're telling me you can't do anything about
It's
this horrible
100,000.
thing. Sorry,
Okay.
100,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100,000 people, we can't do anything for you. So that's, yeah, it's really sad. And in general, again, to be able to develop a DNA profile and put it into CODIS and then start linking cases. I mean, we see that 3,000 are serial offenders, which was very common to get once we started working these 12,000 kits. You were getting the same names hits over and over again. That was very common.
Was it,
So,
excuse me a minute, was it 3,000 or 13,000 were serial sex offenders? Did I get that
uh,
wrong?
I think I have 3 on my notes, but I could
Okay.
be wrong.
I might. All right. Anyway, regardless,
Yeah,
I could be either way. I thought I wrote it down earlier, but anyway. All right. Well,
yeah,
let me ask you this then. We get it into CODIS. What the other part of that is, we're looking at what, maybe 20% of the total at least.
yeah,
Okay. But maybe if you break that down, let's assume your 100,000's valid. It was bad
yep,
evidence. You couldn't do anything with it. Then you're
yep,
talking about, out of the 100,000, you're talking about 20% or more.
yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah,
That's still, I was thinking, a little low, maybe. Am I right or not?
yeah, yeah. No, I would say, I mean, looking at the numbers, it is low. But one thing I would like to throw out is most of these sexual assault kits are old. So if you think about when we were putting CODIS into place in states, people who are arrested in the 80s and 90s when we're maybe working these kits, they weren't put into CODIS because most states are implementing CODIS in the, early 2000s. And so if you're out committing your crimes in the 80s and 90s, and then, you get older, you get a little smarter, whatever the excuse is that you start being not a criminal, your DNA, your standard is not in that CODIS database. So although we have a viable profile that's able to be searched, we don't have that actual standard from that individual to connect those two things. And so I would say that is part of that problem, is just the time frame of when CODIS came into play and when these kits are being worked. So I think a lot of those things, those samples, is when you have especially cases that you're now working from, the 80s and 90s, you're putting it in CODIS, they're hitting each other. It's now time to take it over to that investigative genetic genealogy, because you can then identify, one sample, it's really good, that would work really well with that system. You can then use that one sample, maybe find that person of interest, and then connect it to all of these people that were victims of a crime. So yeah, that CODIS, CODIS is super helpful, but is it the end all and be all to solving a crime? No. Just like DNA isn't the end all and be all to solving a crime. It is helpful. CODIS is an investigative lead. We say that all the time. It should be in the reports. It's an investigative lead, just like an investigator does. It's just a lead. It is not your end all and be all.
That's interesting you say that. I don't know how many times I've lectured on that. And then the other two things, one, I've lectured on that a lot about, listen, guys, DNA is not always the answer. So to me, and I have emphasized this too, I've said detective decisions make the difference in the solving or not solving of a case. Now, might that include evidence in DNA? Yes, but there's
Of
so
course.
many other things that got to come in there. Then the
Yes.
other side of that is too, uh, you can't, and too many people try to do this. They try to take today's standards and apply it to a 1980s case or a 70s case. And I'm saying you can't do that, because that was not the method of operation. That was not the standard at that time. And so if you're trying to find fault, that you're up the wrong tree. I would never accuse anybody of wrongdoing or even attempt to, just because they followed the rules of the time. You know what I mean?
Yes, you can't expect somebody in 1983 in law enforcement to know what's going on in the research world over in England, that DNA and fingerprinting is being is being used over there to solve crimes. No, I definitely think you cannot do that. I think it's important to continue to provide that training to law enforcement, because them being the first first individuals on the scene, their decisions are going to play a role. And so teaching them to do what's best in the here and now, because that's all we can do, is what's going to help this evidence be as helpful and probative as we want it to be once we get to that trial, if that's what it gets to. Yeah, I really encourage all law enforcement to stay. I know it's hard but to do as much training as possible. I mean,
Yes.
you guys got a lot of other things on your plate, but training and knowing how to properly collect evidence and submit it properly, and all of those tiny details, and it's tiny details, but it really can make or break a case eventually, or just really help you in your process of providing you more data and what steps to take next. Like we were just talking about, it's an investigative lead. It's not the end all and be all, but it can provide you with that information that, okay, now I need to go X, now I need to go Y. So yeah, but no, her yelling at somebody for not knowing DNA existed,
Or anything
and
else. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
whatever the next thing is going to be, right? Yeah, how are you supposed to know that? No, but definitely stay up on today's techniques and what's happening. Reach out to your local crime lab.
Well,
Talk.
that's another thing. I think detectives should take a lot of those crime scene courses too, the basic ones at least, just so that they understand that if they got a crime scene unit, they know what those people are doing and they can also contribute to it versus take
Yes.
away. And to me, they're underfunded to the point they don't get that advanced training, and that's enough of it.
Yes.
Let me put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, when I would go out to crime scenes, it was a team effort between what we would call the lab rats and the field mice. The guys and the ladies out working cases, knocking on doors, talking to people, and us working the scene and trying to collect the evidence. Like, they would find something out and then tell us, and then we could do something about it. Or we would find something at the scene and then we could tell them. Like, it has to be a communication between the scientists and law enforcement, and understanding what each other is doing is only going to help ensure that case is going down the right track and working towards the truth, rather than, we've got blinders on and we've got bias and we're just going to do what we think is okay for this time, this moment in time. So it's got to be both people, or both sides, like I said, lab rats and field mice, working together. And that communication has to happen. And that includes educating each other on what, normal is for you. So whether that be, this is how I swab something, or I'm not going to go into an interview and say that to this person, whatever it may be. Cause again, I'm not a cop. So, but yeah, keep those lines of communication open. If you're an investigator with the lab people, trust me, they love talking to cops and helping you guys, understand science and making their lives easier when you collect an item of evidence. Man, I would love if this officer would just, whatever it is, you get to have that conversation with that officer and he's like, oh, that's easy. I could totally do that for you. And it's like, oh, you just made my life so much easier, right? So yeah, keeping those lines of communication open are really helpful for the whole process, for the whole judicial system.
Yeah. I add a little something here that I did a couple of years ago. I was asked to do a lecture for the Texas AG's cold case unit. Actually, it was for a seminar they put on yearly. And when they invited me, I said, I'd like to see who else is talking, what they're going to talk about, because I want to make sure, where I'm on track or
Yes.
not.
Yes.
Well, they were all genealogists except for me. I was the only one with a law enforcement background, except I will admit there was a retired FBI agent working with a genealogist.
Okay.
So, so I looked at this and I immediately went back to my point of contact. I said, make me last. I want
Yeah.
to be the last one to talk.
Yes.
Well, I started off with the detective decision solve cases, not DNA. And of course, that just perked them all up.
Oh,
And that,
everybody was ready to fight at that point.
oh, they were.
Yes.
And but I said, you may think that jokingly, but just think about it a little bit. And then we started talking about the Saki results and some other things. And I said, there is a way to do this. We can't sit back and expect evidence to solve all our cases. We can't expect DNA to be absolute. It's just not there. Well, after it was all over, one of the genealogists, a PhD, whatever she was, probably a biologist or something. Oh,
Yeah.
she was all over. Oh, I got data that counters what you said and everything else. I said, well, then please send it to me. I'd love to
Yes.
look at it. Well,
Yes.
I never heard another word. So,
Yeah,
but
exactly. Yes.
but what I've been able to do in looking, it looks like they get hundreds, if not thousands, of cases, and they do solve a few, but it is a small number considering the total picture. But
Oh, yes.
solving one is better than none. I don't care what anybody says.
Agree. Yes. Yes. And again, I think also the more cases they're able to work, it's becoming more and more normal for this to occur, right? I think with the notoriety of some of the cases that have been solved using uh, investigative genetic genealogy has kind of gotten more people interested in it. But I think, again, that training and knowledge gap is still there of understanding what needs to happen, because most people just say, well, you already have a DNA profile. Like, why can't you just send it to them? And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Like, this is expensive. This is time consuming. This is not something we can just do willy nilly. So yeah, we have to really want this. Not that we don't want all cases to be solved, but like you said, it has to be that perfect case that's going to fit in these criteria so we can do something with it. But solving any case is a big deal, no matter, you know, whether it's the Golden State Killer or the individual who was killed right down the street from us. It's important that we solve those cases and give answers to the families so they have that and it can be put to rest for them as much as, you know, that can happen when something that tragic occurs. So,
Yeah, it's learn the truth, and for me, finality. Not just, I don't like the word closure so much. I like finality because then it is final. You know what happened, and
yes.
and you've already dealt with some of the closure through your grieving and so on over the years. And it is true, it's there as well, but I call it finality. But anyway,
Yeah.
all right,
No, I like that.
we've reached our limit here. I've talked too much. You have done a great
Yeah.
job. I appreciate it. You can sit on my jury anytime you want.
Yes. Excellent. Yes. I can't
Just
wait.
as long as I'm not the defendant.
Defend it. Exactly. Yes.
All right, let me close out here and just hang on.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to say thanks for my listeners. We appreciate you being here. If you should have any questions about the forensic disciplines mentioned in this podcast, please email me at jma.forensicinvestigator@gmail.com or visit my website at www.jma4ensics.com. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy and goodbye.